This podcast may not be suitable for young listeners.
Poachers by Tom Franklin. At dawn on the first day of April, the three Gates brothers banked their 10-foot aluminum boat in a narrow slough of dark water. They tied their hounds and strapped their rifles and stepped out, ducking black magnolia branches heavy with rain and Spanish moss. The two thin younger brothers, denim overalls tucked in their boots, lugged between the styrofoam cooler of iced fish, coons, and possums. The oldest brother, 20, bearded and heavy-set, carried a sunbeam bread sack of eels in his coat pocket. Hooked over his left shoulder was the pink body of a fawn they'd shot and skinned, and over the right a stray dog to which they'd done the same. With skins and heads gone and the dog's tail chopped off, they were difficult to tell apart. The Gateses climbed the hill, clinging to the vines and saplings and slipping in the red clay, their boots coated and enormous by the time they stepped out of the woods. For a moment they stood in the road looking at the gray sky, the clouds piling up. The two younger ones, Neil and Dan, set the cooler down. Kent, the oldest, removed his limp cap and squeezed the water from it, and his brothers did the same. Then Kent nodded, and they picked up the cooler. They rounded a curve and crossed a one-lane bridge, stopping to piss over the rail into the creek water high from all the rain, and then went on, passing houses on either side, dark warped boards with knotholes big enough to look through, and cement blocks for steps. Black men appeared in the doors and windows to watch them go by. To most of these people they were something not seen often, something nocturnal and dangerous. Along the stretch of the Alabama River, everyone knew that the brothers' father, Boo Gates, had married a girl named Anna when he was 30 and she was 17, and that the boys had been born in quick succession, with less than a year between them. But few outside the family knew that a fourth child, a daughter, unnamed, had been stillborn, and that Boo had buried her in an unmarked grave in a clearing in the woods behind their house. Anna died the next day, and the three boys, dirty and naked, watched their father stoop-shouldered descent into the earth as he dug her grave. And by the time he'd finished it, it was dark, and the moon had come up out of the trees, and the boys lay asleep upon each other in the dirt like wolf pups. The name of this community, if it could be called that, was Lower Peachtree, though as far as anybody knew, there'd never been an Upper Peachtree. Scattered along the leafy banks of the river were ragged houses, leaning and drafty, many empty and caving in, so close to the water they'd been built on stilts. Each April floods came, and the crumbling land along the bank would disappear, and each May, when the floodwaters receded, a house or two would be gone. Upriver, near the lock and dam, stood an old store, a slanting, weathered building with a steep tin roof and a stovepipe in the back, two rusty gas pumps on the left beside the road, and the regular pump, empty for years, had a garbage bag tied over it. Around the store, mimosa trees sagged, waterlogged. In front, long steps led up to the door, where in the window a red sign said "Open." Inside to the right, like a bar, a polished maple counter ran along the wall, and behind the counter hung a rack of wire pegs for tools and hardware and fishing tackle. To the left were rows of shelves made of boards and concrete blocks, and beyond the shelves a Coca-Cola cooler buzzed faintly by the wall. The store owner, an old man named Kirksey, had bad knees, and this weather settled around his joints like rot. For most of his life, he'd been married and lived in a nice two-story house on Highway 35, fireplaces in every bedroom, a china cabinet. But when his wife died 2 years ago, cancer, he found it easier to avoid the house, to keep the bills paid and the grass mowed but the doors locked, to spend nights in the store and to sleep in the back room on the army cot and to warm his meals of corned beef and beef stew on a hot plate. He didn't mind that people had all but stopped coming to the store. As long as he served a few long-standing customers, he thought he'd stick around. He had his radio in the Thomasville station and money enough. He liked the area and knew his regulars weren't the kind to drive half an hour to the nearest town. For those few people, Kirksey would go once a week to Grove Hill to shop for goods he'd resell, marking up the price just enough for a reasonable profit. He didn't need the money. It was just good business. Liquor-wise, the county was dry, but that didn't stop Kirksey. For his regulars, he would serve plastic cups of cheap whiskey he bought in the next county, or bottles of beer he kept padlocked in an old refrigerator in back. For these regulars, he would break packages of cigarettes and keep them in a cigar box and sell them for a dime apiece, a nickel stale. Aspirins were 7 cents each, and he would open boxes of shotgun shells or cartridges and sell them for amounts that varied according to caliber. And he'd known to find specialty items, paperback novels, explosives, and once an old magneto telephone. At Euphrates Morset's place, Kent Gates pounded on the back door. In Morset's yard, a cord of wood was stacked between 2 fence posts and covered by a green tarp, brick halves holding the tarp down. A tire swing, turning slowly and full of rainwater, hung from a pine limb. When Morset appeared, he was a large, bald, black man. Kent pointed to the fawn and dog hanging on the porch rail. Morset put on reading glasses and squinted at both. "How about that?" he said, stroking his chin. "I'll be right out, young mens." He closed the door. Kent sat on the porch edge and his brothers on the steps. A skinny, wet dog trotted from under the house, wagging its tail, and Dan began to pet it. When he found a swollen blue tick in its ear, he pulled it off and flicked it across the yard. The door opened and Morset came out with 3 pint jars of homemade whiskey. Each brother took a jar and unscrewed its lid and sniffed the clear liquid. Morset set his steaming coffee cup on the windowsill. He fastened his suspenders, looking at the carcasses hanging over the rail. The brothers were already drinking, Dan still petting the dog, which had its head in his lap. "Where's the girl?" Kent asked, his face twisted from the sour whiskey. "My stepdaughter, you mean?" Morset's Adam's apple pumped in his throat. "She inside." Far away a rooster crowed. "Well, get her out here," Kent said. They drank again and shuddered. "Now, she ain't but 15. Kent scratched his beard. "Just go and look at her." When they left, the stepdaughter was standing on the porch in her white nightgown, barefoot and rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The brothers backed away, clanking with hardware and blushing and grinning at her. Morset's jaw clenched. The dog watched them go and then turned and trotted back underneath the house. Sipping from their jars, they took the bag of eels down the road to a half-blind conjure woman who stood waiting on her porch. Her house, with its dark drapes and empty bird cages dangling from the eaves, seemed to be slipping off into the gully. The younger brothers wiped their noses on their sleeves and shifted from foot to foot by the gate as Kent walked across the muddy yard and held the bag out. She snatched the eels from him, squinting into the bag with her good eye. Grunting, she paid them from a dusty cloth sack on her apron, muttered to herself as Kent turned and walked through her gate, and the 3 of them went up the dirt road. Only Dan, the youngest, looked back. They peddled the rest of the things from their cooler and then left through the dump, pausing while Kent and Neil shot at liquor bottles Dan threw into the air. Out of ammunition, they stumbled down the ravine in the rain, following the water's edge to their boat, and in the back, Kent wedged his jar between his thighs, ran the trolling motor with his foot. His brothers leaned against the walls of the boat, facing opposite banks, no sound but rain and the low hum of the motor. They drank silently, holding their burning whiskey in the hollows of their cheeks before gathering the will to swallow. And along the banks, fallen trees held thick stands of cottonmouth, black sparkling creatures dazed and slow from winter, barely able to move. If not for all the rain, they might still be hibernating, comatose in the banks of the river or beneath the soft yellow underbellies of rotten logs. Rounding a bend, the brothers saw a small boat downriver. Its engine clear, loud, and unfamiliar. It was heading this way. The men in the boat lifted a hand in greeting. He wore a green poncho and a dark hat covered with plastic. Kent shifted his foot, turning the trolling motor and steering them toward the bank, giving the stranger a wide berth. He felt for their outboard's crank rope while Neil and Dan faced forward and sat on the boat seats. The man drawing closer didn't look much older than Kent. He cut his engine and coasted up beside them, smiling. "Morning, fellas," he said, showing his badge. "I'm the new district game warden." The brothers looked straight ahead as if he weren't there. The warden's engine was steaming. A flock of geese passed overhead. Dan slipped his hands inside the soft leather collars of two dogs who'd begun to growl. "You fellas ought to know," the warden said, pointing his long chin to the rifle at Neil's feet, "that it's illegal to have those guns loaded on the river. Now I'm going to have to check them. I'll need to see some licenses, too." When he stood, the dogs jumped forward, toenails scraping the aluminum. Dan jerked them back and glanced at Kent. Kent spat into the brown water. He met the warden's eyes and in an instant knew the man had seen the telephone rig in the floor of their boat. "Pull to the bank," the warden yelled, drawing a pistol. "Y'all are under arrest for poaching." The Gateses didn't move. One of the dogs began to claw the hull, and the others joined him, and a howl rose. "Shut them dogs up." The warden's face had grown blotchy and red. The spotted hound broke free and sprang over the gunwale, slobber strung from his teeth, and the man most surprised by the game warden's shot seemed to be the game warden himself. His face drained of color as the noise echoed off the water and died in the bent black limbs and the cattails that bobbed in the current. The bullet had passed through the front dog's neck and smacked into the bank behind them, missing Dan by inches. The dog collapsed, and there was an instant silence before the others, now loose, clattered overboard into the water, red-eyed, tangled in their leashes, trying to swim. "Pull to the goddamn bank," the warden yelled. "Right now!" Scowling, Kent leaned and spat. He moved his 30-30 aside. Using the shoulders of his brothers for balance, he made his way to the prow. Neil, his cheekbones flecked with the dog's blood, moved to the back to keep the boat level. At the front, Kent reached into the water and took the first dog by its collar, lifted the kicking form and set it streaming and shivering behind him. His brothers turned their faces away as it shook off the water. Kent grabbed the rope that led to the big three-legged hound and pulled it hand over hand until he could work his finger under its collar. He gave Dan a sidelong look, and together they hauled it in. Then Kent grabbed the smaller bitch while Dan got the black and tan. The warden watched them, his hips swaying with the rise and fall of the current. The rain was coming harder now, spattering against the boats. Kneeling among the dogs, Kent unsnapped the leash and tossed the spotted hound overboard, and it sank and then resurfaced and floated on its side, trailing blood. Kent's lower lip twitched, and he looked at Neil and opened his mouth. Dan whispered to the dogs and placed his hands on two of their heads to calm them. They were retching and trembling and rolling their eyes fearfully at the trees. Neil stood up with his hands raised as if to surrender. When the game warden looked at him, relief softening his eyes, Kent jumped from his crouch into the other boat, his big fingers closing around the man's neck. Later that morning, Kirksey had just unlocked the door and hung out the open sign when he heard the familiar rattle of Gates' truck. He sipped his coffee and leant behind the counter and sat on his stool. The boys came several times a week, usually in the afternoon, before they started their evenings of hunting and fishing. Kirksey would give them what supplies they needed, bullets and fishing line and socks, a new cap to replace one lost in the river. They would fill their trucks and cans with gas. 18-year-old Dan would get the car battery from the charger near the wood-burning stove and replace it with the drained one from their boat trolling motor. Kirksey would serve them coffee or cokes, never liquor, not to boys, and they'd eat whatever they chose from the shelves, usually candy bars or barbecue potato chips, ignoring Kirksey's advice to eat healthier, Vienna sausages and Dinty Moore or Chef Boyardee. Today they came in looking a little spooked, Kirksey thought. Neil stayed near the door, peering out, the glass fogging by his mouth. His arms folded, and Dan went to the candy aisle and pocketed several Hershey bars. He left a trail of muddy boot prints behind him. Kirksey would have to mop later. "Morning, young fellas," he said. "Coffee?" Dan nodded. Kirksey refilled a styrofoam cup and then grinned as the boy loaded it with sugar. "You take coffee with your sweetener?" he asked. Kent leaned on the computer, inspecting the items hanging on their pages. A hacksaw, a Lucky 13 lure, a set of Allen wrenches, a gizmo with several uses, knife, measuring tape, and all. He took off his cap and balled it in his fist. Kirksey could smell the booze on him. "Y'all need something in particular?" he asked. "That spotted one you give us," Kent said, not meeting his eyes. "It won't bark no more." "She won't bark no more?" "No, trim fine, but won't bark nary a time. Got to shoot her." His mouth full of chocolate, Dan looked at Kirksey, and by the door, Neil unfolded his arms. "No," Kirksey said. "Ain't no need for that, Kent. Do what that conjure woman recommends. Now go out in the woods and find you a locust shell stuck to a tree. This is the time of year for 'em, if I'm not mistaken." "A locust shell?" Kent asked. "Yeah. Bring it back home and crunch it up in the dog's scraps, and that'll make her bark like she ought to." Kent nodded to Kirksey and walked to the door. He went out and his brothers followed. "See you," Kirksey called. "You're welcome." Dan waved with a Hershey bar and closed the door. Kirksey stared after them for a while. It had been more than a year since they'd paid him anything, but he couldn't bring himself to ask for money. He'd even stopped writing down what they owed. He got his coffee and limped from behind the counter to the easy chair by the stove. He shook his head at the muddy footprints on the candy aisle. He sat slowly and tucked a blanket around his legs and took out a bottle and added a splash to his coffee. And sipping, he picked up a novel, Louis L'Amour, Sackett's Land, and reached in his apron pocket for his glasses. Though she had been one once, the woman named Esther wasn't much of a regular in Kirksey's store these days. She lived 2 miles upriver in a shambling white house with massive magnolia trees in the yard. The house had a wraparound porch, and when it flooded, you could fish from the back sitting in the tall white rocking chairs, though you weren't likely to catch anything, a baby alligator maybe, or sometimes bullfrogs. Owls nested in the trees along her part of the river, but in this weather they'd grown quiet, and she missed their hollow calling. Esther was 50. She'd had 2 husbands and 6 children who were gone and had ill feelings toward her. She'd had her female parts removed in an operation that she was still paying for. Now she lived alone and most of the time drank alone. If the Gates boys hadn't passed out in their truck somewhere in the woods, they might stop by after a night's work. Esther would make them strong coffee and feed them salty fried eggs and link sausages, and some mornings, like today, she would get a faraway look in her eyes and take Kent's shirt in her fingers and lead him up the stairs and watch him close the bathroom door and listen to the sounds of his bathing. She smiled, knowing these were the only baths he ever took. When he emerged, his long hair stringy, his chest flat and hard, she led him down the hall past the telephone nook to her bedroom. He crawled under the covers and watched her take off her gown and step out of her underwear. Bending, she looked in the mirror to fluff her hair and then climbed in beside him. He was gentle at first, curious and then rougher, the way she liked him to be. She closed her eyes, the bed frame rattling and bumping, and her father's old pocket watch slipping off the nightstand. Water gurgled in the pipework in the walls as Neil took a bath too, hoping for a turn of his own, which never had happened, at least not yet. "Slow down, baby," Esther whispered into Kent's ear. "There's plenty of time." On April 3rd, it was still raining. Kirksey put aside his crossword to answer the telephone. "Can you come down to the lock and dam?" Goodloe asked. "We got us a situation developing here." Kirksey disliked smart-ass Goodloe, but something in the sheriff's voice told him it was serious. On the news, he'd heard that the new game warden had been missing for 2 days. The authorities had dragged the river all night and had a helicopter in the air. Kirksey sat forward in his chair, waiting for his back to loosen a bit. He added a shot of whiskey to his coffee and gulped it down as he shrugged into his denim jacket, zipping it up to his neck because he stayed cold when it rained. He put cotton balls in his ears and set his cap on his bald head and took his walking cane from beside the door. In his truck, the 4-wheel drive engaged and the defroster on high, he sank and rose in the deep ruts and gobs of mud flying past his windows, the wipers swishing across his view. The radio announcer said it was 60 degrees and more rain on the way. Then Loretta Lynn began to sing. A mile from the lock and dam, Kirksey passed a Grove Hill ambulance, axle deep in the mud. A burly black paramedic was wedging a piece of 2x4 beneath one of the rear tires, while the bored-looking driver sat behind the wheel smoking and racing the engine. Kirksey slowed and rolled down his window. "Y'all going after a live one or a dead one?" "Dead, Mr. Kirksey," the black man answered. Kirksey nodded and accelerated. At the lock and dam, he could see a crowd of people and umbrellas, and beyond them he saw the dead man, lying on the ground under a black raincoat. Some onlooker had begun to direct traffic. Goodloe and 3 deputies in yellow slickers stood near the body with their hands in their pockets. Kirksey climbed out, and people nodded somberly and parted to let him through. Goodloe, who had been talking to his deputies, ceased as Kirksey approached, and they stood looking at the raincoat. "Morning, sugar baby," Kirksey said, using the nickname Goodloe hated. "Is this who I think it is?" "Yep," Goodloe said. "Rookie Game Warden of the Year." With his cane, Kirksey pulled back the raincoat to reveal the white face. "He's a young fella," he said. There was a puddle beneath the dead man, twigs in his hair, and a clove of moss in his breast pocket. With the rubber tip of his cane, Kirksey brushed a snail from the man's forehead. He bent and looked into the warden's left eye, which was partly open, and he noticed the throat, the dark bruises there. Goodloe unfolded a handkerchief and blew his nose and then wiped it. "Don't go abusing the evidence, Kirksey." He stuffed the handkerchief into his back pocket. "Evidence? Now, sugar baby." Goodloe exhaled and looked at the sky. "Don't shit me, Kirksey. You know good and well who done this. I expect they figured the law wouldn't apply to them up on this part of the river, the way things has been all these years. Them other wardens scared of 'em or feeling sorry for 'em. But I reckon that's fixing to change." He paused. "I had to place a call to the Capitol this morning to let 'em know that we was all out of game wardens, and you won't believe who they patched me through to." Kirksey adjusted the cotton in his right ear. "Old Frank David himself," the sheriff said. "Ain't nothing ticks him off more than this kind of thing." A dread stirred in Kirksey's belly. Frank David? Was he a relation to this fella? "Teacher," Goodloe said. "Said he's been giving lessons to young game wardens over at the Forestry Service. He asked me a whole bunch of questions, regular interrogation. Said this here young fella was the cream of the crop, the best new game warden there was." "Wouldn't know it from this angle," Kirksey said. Goodloe grunted. A photographer from the paper was studying the corpse. He glanced at the sky as if gauging the light. And when he snapped his first picture, Kirksey was in it like a sportsman. "Well, what do you want from me?" he asked Goodloe. "You tell them boys I need to ask them some questions. And I ain't fixing to traipse all over the county. I'll drop by the store this evening." "If they're there, they're there," Kirksey said. "I ain't their damn father." Goodloe followed him to the truck. "You might think of getting 'em a lawyer," he said through the window. Kirksey started the engine. "Shit, sugar baby, them boys don't need a lawyer. They just need to stay in the woods where they belong. Folks ought to know to let 'em alone by now." Goodloe stepped back from the truck and smacked his lips. "I don't reckon anybody got around to telling that to the deceased." Driving, Kirksey remembered the Gates brothers when they were younger, before their father shot himself. He pictured the three blonde heads in the front of Boo's boat as he motored upriver past the store, lifting a solemn hand to Kirksey, where he stood with a broom on his little back porch. After Boo's wife and newborn daughter had died, he taught those boys all he knew about the woods, about fishing and tracking and hunting and killing. He kept them in his boat all night as he telephoned catfish and checked his trot lines and jugs and shot things on the bank. He'd given each of his sons a job to do, one cranking the phone, another netting the stunned catfish, the third adjusting the chain that dragged along the bottom and the wire which conducted electricity from the telephone's magnet into the water. Boo would tie a piece of rope around his son's waist and loop the other end to his ankle in case one of the boys fell out. Downriver, in the moonlight, Kent would pull in the trot lines while Dan handed him a cricket or a catawba worm for the hook. Neil took the bass or perch or catfish Kent gave him and slit its soft, cold belly with a knife and ran 2 fingers up into the fish and drew out its palmful of guts and dumped them overboard. Sometimes on warm nights, grinnell or cottonmouths or young alligators would follow them, drawn by the blood. A danger, too, was catching a snake or snapping turtle on the trot line, and each night Boo whispered for Kent to be careful, to lift the line with a stick to see what he had there instead of using his bare hand. During the morning, they would leave the boat tied, and the boys would follow their fathers back through the trees from trap to trap, stepping when he stepped and not talking. Boo emptied the traps and rebaited them, while behind him Kent put the carcasses in his squirrel pouch. In the afternoons, they gutted and skinned what they'd brought home. What time was left before dark they spent sleeping in the feather bed in the cabin where, barely a memory, their mother and sister had died. After Boo's suicide, Kirksey had tried to look after the boys. Their ages 12, 13, and 14, just old enough, Boo must have thought, to raise themselves. And for a while, Kirksey let them stay with him and his wife, who'd never had a child. He tried to send them to school, but they were past learning to read and write, got expelled the first day for fighting and ganging up on a black kid. They were past the kind of life Kirksey's wife was used to living. They scared her, the way they watched her with eyes narrowed into black lines, the way they ate with their hands, and the way they wouldn't talk. What she didn't know was that from those years of wordless nights on the river and silent days in the woods, they had developed a kind of language of their own, a language of the eyes, of the fingers, and the way a shoulder twitched, nodded the head. Because his wife's health wasn't good in those days, Kirksey had returned the boys to their cabin in the woods. He spent most Saturdays with them, trying to take up where Boo had left off, bringing them food and milk and clothes and new shoes and reading them books and teaching them things and telling them stories. He'd worked out a deal with Esther, who used to take hot food to them in the evenings and wash their clothes. Slowing to let 2 buzzards hop away from a dead deer, Kirksey lit a cigarette and wiped the foggy windshield with the back of his hand. He thought of Frank David, Alabama's legendary game warden. Now, there were dozens of stories about the man. Kirksey had heard and told them for years and had repeated them to the Gates boys, even made some up to try to scare them into obeying the law. Now the truth and the fictions were confused in his mind, and he remembered one. A dark moonless night, and two poachers used a spotlight to freeze a buck in the darkness and shoot it. They take hold of its wide rack of antlers and struggle to drag the big deer when suddenly they realize that now there's three men pulling. The first poacher jumps and says, "Hey, it ain't supposed to be but two of us dragging this deer." And Frank David says, "Ain't supposed to be none of y'all dragging a deer." The Gates boys came in the store just before closing, smelling like the river. Nodding to Kirksey, they went to the shelves and began selecting cans of things to eat. Kirksey poured himself a generous shot of whiskey. He'd stopped by their cabin earlier, not finding them there, left a quarter on the steps, a signal he hadn't used in years. "Sheriff Goodlow's coming tonight," he said to Kent. "Wants to ask you if you know anything about that dead game warden." Kent shot the other boys a look. "Now, I don't know if y'all ever seen that fella," Kirksey said, "and I'm not asking you to tell me." He paused in case they wanted to. "But that's what old Sugar Baby's going to have on his mind, and if it was y'all, I just wouldn't tell him anything. Just say that I was at home, that I don't know nothing about any dead game warden, nothing at all." Kent shrugged and walked down the aisle that he was on and stared out the back window, though there wasn't anything to see except trees, ghostly and bent when lightning came. His brothers took seats by the stove and began to eat. Kirksey watched and remembered when he used to read to them, Tarzan of the Apes and the Return of Tarzan. The boys had wanted to hear the books over and over. They loved the jungle, the elephants, the rhinos, the gorillas, the anacondas 30 feet long. They would listen intently, their eyes bright in the light of the stove, Dan holding his small dirty fingers the slinky Kirksey had given him as a Christmas present, his lips moving along with Kirksey's voice, mouthing some of the words, the great apes, Numa the lion, La Queen of Apor, and the Lost City. They had listened to his Frank David stories the same way, the game warden rising from the black water beside a tree on a moonless night, a tracker so keen he could see in the dark, could follow a man through the deepest swamp by smelling the fear in his sweat, a bent-over shadow stealing between the beaver lodges, the cypress trees, the tangle of limb and vine, parting the long wet bangs of Spanish moss with his rifle barrel and creeping toward the glowing windows of the poacher's cabin, the deer hides nailed to the wall, the gator pelts, the fish with their grim smiles hooked to a clothesline, and turtle shells like army helmets drying in the windowsills. Any pit bull meant to guard the place, lying behind him with its throat slit. Frank David slips out of the fog, with fog still clinging to the brim of his hat. He circles the cabin and peers in each window, mounts the porch, puts his shoulder through the front door, stands with wood splinters landing on the floor at his feet. A man of average height, clean-shaven, no threat until the big hands come up and curl into fists, knuckles scarred, blue and sharp. Kirksey finished his drink and poured another, and it burned pleasantly in his belly. He looked at Neil and Dan, occupied by their bags of corn kernels. A Merle Haggard song ended on the radio, and Kirksey clicked it off, sparing the boys the evening news. In the quiet, Kirksey heard Goodlow's truck. He glanced at Kent, who probably had been hearing it for a while. Outside, Goodlow slammed his door, and he hurried up the steps and tapped on the window. Kirksey exaggerated his limp and took his time letting him in. "Good evening," Goodlow said, shaking the water from his hands. He took off his hat and hung it on the nail by the door and then hung up his yellow slicker. "Evening, Sugar Baby," Kirksey said. "If I can volunteer a little understatement here," Goodlow said, "it's a tad wet tonight." "Yep." Kirksey went behind the counter and refilled his glass. "You just caught the tail end of happy hour. That is, if you're off the wagon again. Can I sell you a tonic and warm you up? You know we're in a dry county, Kirksey. Would that be a no?" "It's a watch your ass." Goodlow looked at the brothers. "Just wanted to ask these boys some questions." "Well, have at it, Sugar Baby." Goodlow walked to the lance rack and detached a package of nip cheese crackers. He opened it, offered the pack to each of the boys. Only Dan took one. Smiling, Goodloe bit a cracker in half and turned a chair around, sat with his elbows across its back. He looked over toward Kent, half hidden by shadow. He chewed slowly. Come on out here so I can see you, boy. I ain't gonna bite. Nothing but these stale-ass crackers. Kent moved a step closer, his eyes down, focused on Goodloe's boots. Goodloe took out a notepad. Where was y'all between the hours of 4 and 8 a.m. 2 days ago? Kent looked at Neil. Asleep, Neil said. Goodloe snorted. Now come on, boys. The whole darn county knows y'all ain't slept a night in your life. Y'all was out on the river, weren't you, making a few telephone calls? You saying he's a liar? Kirksey asked. I'm posing the questions here. Goodloe chewed on another cracker. Hell, everybody knows them other game wardens has been letting y'all get away with all kinds of shit. I reckon this dead fella had something to prove, being new and all. Sounds like he ought to use the life jacket, Kirksey said, wiping the counter. It appears, Goodloe studied Kent, that he might have been strangled. You got an alibi, boy? Kent lowered his eyes, took his hands out of his pockets and balled them into fists. Goodloe sighed. I mean, Christ, is there anybody that can back up what you're saying? The windows flickered. Yeah, Kirksey said, I can. Goodloe turned and faced the storekeeper. You? That's right. They were here with me, here in the store. Goodloe looked amused. They was they? Well, okay, Mr. Kirksey. How come you didn't mention that to me this morning? Saved us all a little time? Kirksey sought Kent's eyes, but saw nothing there. No understanding, no appreciation, no fear. He went back to wiping the counter. Well, I guess because they was passed out and drunk. And I didn't want to say anything, being as I was, giving alcohol to young'uns. But now that it's come down to murder, you figured you'd just better own up. Something like that, said Kirksey. Goodloe stared at Kirksey for a long time. Neither would look away. Then the sheriff turned to the boys. Y'all ever heard of Frank David? Dan nodded. Well, Goodloe said, looks like he's aiming to be this district's game warden. I figure he pulled some strings, what he did. Kirksey came from behind the counter. That all your questions? It's past closing and these young'uns need to go home and get some sleep. He went to the door and opened it and stood waiting. All righty then, the sheriff said, standing. I expect I ought to be getting back to the office anyhow. He winked at Kirksey. See you or these boys don't leave the county for a few days. This ain't over yet. He put the crackers in his coat. I expect y'all might be hearing from Frank David, too, he said, watching the boys' faces, but there was nothing to see. Alone later, Kirksey put out the light and bolted the door. He went to adjust the stove and found himself staring out the window, looking into the dark where he knew the river was rising and swirling, tires and plastic garbage can lids and dead wood from upriver floating past. He struck a match and lit a cigarette. The glow of his ash reflected in the window, and he saw himself years ago, telling the boys these stories. How Frank David would sit so still in the woods waiting for poachers that dragonflies would perch on his nose, and gnats would walk over his eyeballs. Nobody knew where he came from, but Kirksey had heard that he'd been orphaned as a baby in a fire and found half-starved in the swamp by a Cajun woman. She raised him on the slick red clay banks of the Tombigbee River among lean black poachers and moonshiners. He didn't even know how old he was, people said. And they said he was the best poacher ever, the craftiest, the meanest, that he'd cut a drunk logger's throat in a juke joint knife fight one night, that he'd fled south and underage joined the Marines in Mobile and wound up in Korea, the infantry, where because of his shooting ability and his stealth, they made him a sniper. Before he left that country, he'd registered over 100 kills. Communist half a world away who never saw him coming. Back home in Alabama, he disappeared for a few years and then showed up at the state game warden's office demanding a job. Some people had heard in the intervening time he'd gotten religion. "What makes you think I ought to hire you?" the head game warden asked him. "Because I spent 10 years of my life poaching right under your damn nose," Frank David said. The Gates boys' pickup was the same old Ford their father had shot himself in several years before, heartbroken over their mother's death. The bullet hole in the roof had rusted out, but was now covered with a strip of duct tape from Kirksey's store. Spots of the truck's floor were rusted away, too, so things in the road often flew up into their laps. Rocks and Budweiser cans and a king snake they were trying to run over. The truck was older than any of them, only one thin prong left of the steering wheel and the holes from the missing knobs in the dash. It was a 3-speed, a column shifter, the gear stick covered with a buck's dried ball sack. The window and windshield, busted or shot out years before, hadn't been replaced because most of the driving took them along back roads after dark or in the fields, and the things they came upon were easier shots without glass. Though he'd never had a license, Kent drove, had since he was 8. Neil rode shotgun, and tonight both were drinking, and in the back Dan stood holding his rifle, trying to keep his balance. Below the soles of his boots the floor was soft, a terry black from the blood of all the animals they'd killed. You could see spike antlers and forelegs and hooves of deer, teeth and feathers and fur, the brittle beaks and beards of turkeys, and the delicate hinged leg bone of something molded in the sludge like a fossil. Just beyond a no trespassing sign already gnawed up by bullets, Kent swerved off the road and they bounced and slid through a field in the rain, shooting at rabbits. Then they split up, the younger boys checking traps, one on each side of the river, and Kent in the boat rebaiting their trot lines the way his father had shown him. They met at the truck just before midnight, untied the dogs and tromped over a steep logging path, Dan on one end of 4 leashes and the lunging hounds on the other. When they got to the bottomland, he unclipped the leashes and loosed the dogs, and the brothers followed the baying ahead in the dark, aiming their flashlights into the black mesh of trees where the eyes of coons and possums gleamed like rubies. The hounds bayed and frothed and clawed at the trunks of trees and leaped into the air and landed and leaped again, and their sides pumping and ribs showing. When the Gateses came to the river 2 hours later, the dogs were lapping water and panting. Dan bent and rubbed their ears and let them lick his cheeks. His brothers rested and drank, belching at the sky, and after a time they leashed the hounds and staggered downstream to the live oak where their boat was tied. They loaded the dogs in and shoved off into the fog and trolled over the still water. In the middle, Neil lowered the wire and the chain, stolen from a child's swing set, behind the boat and began cranking the old telephone, which he held between his legs. Dan netted the stunned catfish. You couldn't catch them with your hand or they'd come to, and he threw them into the cooler, where in a few seconds the waking fish would begin to thrash. In the rear, Kent propped his rifle on his knees and watched the bank in case a coyote wandered down hunting bullfrogs. They climbed out of the woods into the dirt road in the misty dawn, plying through the muddy yards and pissing by someone's front porch in plain sight of the face inside. A few houses down, Morset didn't come to his door, and when Kent tried the handle, it was locked. He looked at Neil, then put his elbow through the glass and reached in and unlocked it. While his brothers searched for liquor, Dan ate the biscuits he found wrapped in tinfoil on the stove. He found a box of cornflakes in the cabinet, and he ate most of them, too. He ate a plate of cold-fried liver. Neil was in a bedroom looking under the bed. And in the closet, he was going through drawers and his dirty fingers smudged white shirts. And in the back of the house, Kent found a bathroom door locked from in the side. He jimmied it open with his knife, and when he came into the kitchen, he had a gallon jar of whiskey under his arm and Euphrates' stepdaughter by the wrist. Dan stopped chewing, crumbs falling from his mouth. He approached the girl and put his hand out to touch her, but Kent pushed him hard into the wall. Well, Dan stayed there, a clock ticking beside his head, and a string of spit linking his open lips, watching as his brother ran his rough hands up and down the girl's shivering body. Her eyes were closed and lips trembling in prayer. Looking down, Kent saw the puddle spreading around her bare feet. Dan giggled and then put his hand over his mouth. "Shit," Kent said, letting her go. "She pissed herself." She shrank back against the wall behind the door and was still there along with a bag of catfish on the table when her stepfather came back a half an hour later, 10 gallons of whiskey under the tarp in his truck. On that same Saturday, Kirksey drove to the chicken fights held in Heflin Bradford's bulging barn, deep in the woods, cloudy with mosquitoes. He passed a hand-painted sign that had been there forever, as long as he could remember, nailed to a tree. It said, "Jesus is coming." Kirksey climbed out of his truck and buttoned his collar, his ears full of cotton. Heflin's wife worked beneath the rented awning, grilling chicken and sausages and selling cokes and beer. Gospel music played from a portable radio by her head, and Heflin's grandson Nolan took the price of admission at the barn door and stamped the backs of white hands and the cracked pink palms of black ones. Men in overalls and baseball caps that said Cat Diesel Power or STP stood at the tailgates of their pickups, smoking cigarettes, stooping to peer into the cages where the roosters paced. The air was filled with windy rain spits and the crowing of roosters, the ground littered with limp, dead birds. A group of loggers was discussing Frank David, and Kirksey paused to listen. "He's the one caught that bunch over in Washington County," one man said. "Them alligator poachers." "Sugar Baby said 2 of them wound up in intensive care," another one claimed. "Said they pulled a gun and old Frank David went crazy with an axe handle." Kirksey moved on and paid the $5 admission. In the barn, there were bleachers along the walls and a big circular wooden fence in the center, and a dome of chicken wire over the top. Kirksey found a seat at the bottom next to the back door, near a group of mean old farts he'd known for 40 years. People around them called out bets, and bets were accepted. Cans of beer were lifted, and Kirksey produced a thermos of coffee and a dented tin cup. He poured the coffee, then added whiskey from a bottle that went back into his coat pocket. The tin cup warmed his fingers as he squinted through his bifocals to see which bird to bet on. In separate corners of the barn, 2 bird handlers doused their roosters' heads and asses with rubbing alcohol to make them fight harder. They tightened the long steel curved spurs. When the referee in the center of the ring indicated it was time, the handlers entered the pen, each cradling his bird in his arms. They flashed the roosters at one another until their feathers had ruffled with bloodlust and rage, and the roosters pedaled the air, stretching their necks toward each other. The handlers kept them a breath apart for a second, then withdrew them to their corners, whispering in their ears. When the referee tapped the ground 3 times with his stick, the birds were unleashed. They charged and rose in the center of the ring, gouging with spur and beak, the handlers circling the fight like crabs, blood on their forearms and faces, ready to seize their roosters at the referee's cry of "handle." A clan of Louisiana Cajuns watched, and they emerged red-eyed from a van in a marijuana cloud, skinny and shirtless men with oily ponytails and goatees and tattoos of symbols of black magic. Under their arms they carried thick white hooded roosters to pit against the reds and blacks of the locals. Their women had stumbled out of the van behind them, high yellow like gypsies, big-lipped and big-chested girls in halter tops tied at their bellies and miniskirts and moccasins. In the ring, the Cajuns kissed their birds on the beaks, and one tall, completely bald Cajun wearing gold earrings in both ears put his bird's whole head in his mouth. His girl, too, came barefoot into the ring, tattoo of a snake on her shoulder, and took the bird's head into her mouth. "Bet on them white ones," a friend whispered to Kirksey. "These ones round here ain't ever seen a white rooster. They don't know what they're fighting." That evening, bending to check a trap in the woods north of the river, Dan took hold of a sapling and yelped when a spray of water rained on him. He crouched, dripping, and waited while the drumming of his heart slowed, forced himself to rise and move on so his brothers wouldn't laugh at him for being afraid. Near dark, in the wooden trap next to an old fence row, he was surprised to find a tiny white fox they'd once seen cross the road in front of their truck. He squatted before the trap and poked a stick through the wire at the thin snout, his hand steady despite the way the fox snapped at the stick and bit off the end. Would the witch woman want this alive? And at the thought of her, he looked around. It felt like she was watching him, as if she were hiding in a tree in the form of some animal, a possum or a swamp rat or a chicken snake. He stood and dragged the trap through the mud and over the land, while in the trap the fox jumped in circles, growling. A mile upstream, Neil had lost a boot to the mud and was hopping back on one foot to retrieve it. It stood buried to the ankle. He wrenched it free and then sat with his back against a sweep gum to scrape off the mud. He'd begun to lace the boot when he saw a hollow tree stump. Something moved inside. With his rifle barrel, he rolled the thing out. It was most of the body of a dead catfish and the movement from the maggots devouring it. When he kicked it, they spilled from the fish like rice pellets and lay throbbing in the mud. Downstream, as night came and the rain fell harder, Kent trolled their boat across the river, flashlight in his mouth, using a stick to pull up the trot line length by length and removing the fish or turtles and rebaiting the hooks and dropping them back in the water. Near the bank, approaching the last hook, he heard something. He looked up with a flashlight in his teeth to see the thing untwirling in the air. It wrapped around his neck like a rope, and for an instant he thought he was being hanged. He grabbed the thing. It flexed and tightened, and then his neck burned and went numb, and he felt dizzy, his fingertips buzzing, his legs weak, a tree on the bank distorting, doubling, tripling into a whole line of fuzzy shapes, turning sideways and floating. Kent blinked and felt his eyes bulging and his tongue swelling. His head was about to explode, and then a bright light. His brothers found the boat at dawn, 4 miles downstream, lodged on the far side in a fallen tree. They exchanged a glance and then looked back across the river. A heavy gray fog hooded the water, and the boat appeared and dissolved in the ghostly limbs around it. Neil sat on a log and took off his boots and left them standing by a log. And he removed his coat and laid it over the boots. He handed his brother his rifle without looking at him, left him watching as he climbed down the bank, hands and elbows in the air, like a believer waded into the water. Dan propped the second rifle against a tree and stood on the bank holding his own gun, casting his frightened eyes up and down the river. From far away, a woodpecker drummed. Crows began to collect in a pine tree downstream. And after a while, Dan squatted, thinking of their dogs tied to the bumper of their truck. They'd be under the tailgate, probably trying to keep dry. Soon, Neil had trolled the boat back across, and together they pulled it out of the water and stood looking at their brother, who lay across the floor among the fish and turtles that he'd caught. One greenish terrapin, still alive, a hook in its lip, stared back. They both knew what they were supposed to think. The blood and the sets of twin fang marks and the black bruises and shriveled skin, the neck swollen like mumps, the purple bulb of a tongue between his lips. They were supposed to think cottonmouth. Kent's hands were squeezed into fists, and they were hardened that way. The skin wrinkled, and his eyes were half open. His rifle lay unfired in the boat, and the telephone rig seemed untouched, as if indeed a snake had done this. But it wasn't the tracks of a snake they found when they went to get the white fox. The fox was gone, and the trap was empty, its catch sprung. Neil knelt his hand and ran his knuckles along the rim of the boot print in the mud. Not a very wide track, not very far from the next one. He put his finger in the black water that had already begun to fill the track, not too deep. He looked up at Dan, the print of an average-sized man. In no hurry, Neil rose and they began. Above them, the sky cracked and flickered, silently and quickly. No time to get the dogs, they followed the trail back through the woods, losing it once and twice and backtracking and working against the rain that fell and fell harder, that puddled blackly and crept up their legs until they stood in the water to their ankles, rain beating on the brims of their caps, and they gazed at the ground and the sky, at the rain streaming down each other's muddy faces. At the truck, Dan jumped into the driver's seat and reached for the keys. Neil appeared in the window shaking his head, and when Dan didn't scoot over, the older boy hit him in the jaw through the window and then slung open the door and pulled Dan out, sending him rolling over the ground. Neil climbed in and had trouble getting the truck choked. By the time he had the hang of it, Dan had gotten into the back and sat among the wet dogs, staring at his dead brother's eyes. At their cabin, they carried Kent into the woods. They laid him on the ground and began digging near where their sister, mother, and father were buried in their unmarked graves. For 3 hours they worked, the dogs coming from under the porch and sniffing around Kent and whining and watching the digging, finally sleeking off and crawling back under the porch. An hour later, they came out again and stood in a group at the edge of the yard, baying. The boys paused but saw and heard nothing. When the dogs kept making noise, Neil got his rifle and fired into the woods several times. He nodded to his brother, and they went back to digging. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon, and the hole was full of slimy water, and they were black with mud. They each took one of Kent's boots, and Neil got the things from his pockets. They stripped off his shirt and pants and socks and lowered him naked into the hole. And when he bobbed to the top of the water, they got stones and weighted him down, and then shoveled mud into the grave. They showed up at Esther's, black as tar. "Where's Kent?" she asked, holding her robe at her throat. "We buried him," Neil said, moving past her into the kitchen. She put a hand over her mouth, and as Neil told her what they'd found, she slumped against the door looking outside. An owl flew past in the floodlights. She thought of calling Kirksey, but decided to wait until morning. The old bastard thought that she was a slut and a corruption. For tonight, she'd just keep them safe in her house. Neil went to the den. He turned on the TV. The reception was bad because of the weather. Dan, a bruise on the left cheek, climbed the stairs. He went into one of the bedrooms and closed the door behind him. It was chilly in the room, and he noticed pictures of people on the wall, children and a tall man and a younger woman he took to be Esther. She'd been pretty then. He stood dripping on the floor, looking into her black and white face, searching for signs of a woman he knew now. Soon the door opened behind him and she came in, and though he still wore his filthy wet clothes, she steered him to the bed and guided him down onto the edge of it. She unbuckled his belt and removed his hunting knife and stripped the belt off, and she unbuttoned his shirt and rubbed her fingers across his chest, the hair just beginning to thicken there. She undid his pants and ran the zipper down its track, and she worked them over his thighs and knees and ankles and draped them across the back of the chair. She pulled off his boots and socks and pushed him back onto the bed and pried a finger beneath the elastic of his underwear and felt what had already happened. He looked at her face, his mouth open. Esther touched his chin, the scratch of whiskers, his breath on her hand. "Hush now," she said, and watched him fall asleep. Downstairs, the TV went off. When Goodloe knocked, Esther answered, a cold sliver of her face in the cracked door. "The hell you want?" "Good evening to you, too. The Gates is here?" "No." Goodloe glanced at him. "Believe that's their truck. It's kind of hard to mistake, especially for a trained lawman. We're just cruising by and seen it." She tried to close the door, but Goodloe had his foot in it. He glanced at the 3 deputies who stood importantly by the blazer. They dropped their cigarettes and crushed them out. They unsnapped their holsters and strode across the yard, standing behind Goodloe with their hands on their revolvers and their legs apart like TV deputies. "Why don't you just leave 'em alone?" Esther said. "Ain't they been through enough?" "Tell 'em I'd like to see 'em," Goodloe said. "Tell 'em to get their boots." "You just walk straight to hell, mister." Dan appeared behind her, lines from the bed linen on his face. "Whoa, Nellie," Goodloe said. "Boy, you look plumb terrible. Why don't you let us carry you on down to the office for a little coffee, a little cake?" He glanced back at one of the deputies. "We got any of that cinnamon roll left, Dave?" "Do you have a warrant for their arrest?" Esther asked. "No, I ain't got a warrant for their arrest. They ain't under arrest. They're fixing to get questioned, that's all. Strictly informal." Goodloe winked. "You reckon you could do without 'em for a couple of hours?" "Fuck you, sugar baby." The door slammed. Goodloe nodded down the side of the house, and two deputies went to make sure nobody escaped from the back. But in a minute, Dan came out dressed, his hands in his pockets, and followed Goodloe down the stairs, the deputies watching him closely and watching the house. "Where's your brothers?" Goodloe asked. He looked down. Goodloe nodded to the house, and the two deputies went in, guns drawn. They came out a few minutes later, frowning. "Must have heard us coming," Goodloe said. "Well, we got this one. We'll find them other two tomorrow." They got into the Blazer, and Goodloe looked at Dan, sitting in the back. "Put them cuffs on him," Goodloe said. Holding his rifle, Neil came out of the woods when the Blazer was gone, and he returned to the house. "They got Dan," Esther said. "Why didn't you come tell 'em they was out there?" "Boy got to learn," Neil said. He went to the cabinet where she kept the whiskey and took the bottle. She watched him go to the sofa and sit down in front of the blank TV. Soon she joined him, bringing glasses. He filled both, and when they emptied them, he filled them again. They spent the night like that, and at dawn they were drunk. Wearing her robe, Esther began clipping her fingernails, a cigarette smoking in an ashtray beside her. She'd forgotten about calling Kirksey. Neil was telling her about the biggest catfish they'd ever called up. It's 100 pounds, he swore. 150. "You could have put your whole head in that old cat's mouth," he said, sipping his whiskey. "Back fin long as your damn arm." He stood and walked to the front window. There were toads in the yard. With the river swelling, they were everywhere. In the evenings, there were rain frogs. The yard had turned into a pond, and each night the rain frogs sang. It was like no other sound. Esther said it kept her up all night. "That and some other things," she said. Neil heard a fingernail land in the ashtray. He rubbed his hand across his chin and felt the whiskers there. He watched the toads as they huddled in the yard, still as rocks and bloated and miserable looking. "That catfish was green," he said, sipping. "I swear before God, green as grass. Them goddamn rain frogs," she said. "I just lay there at night with my hands over my ears." A clipping rang the ashtray. He turned and went to her on the sofa. "There was moss growing on his nose," he said, putting his hand inside her robe on her knee. "Go find your brother," she said, and she got up and walked unsteadily across the floor and went into the bathroom and closed the door. And when she came out, he and the bottle were gone. Without Kent, Neil felt free to do what he wanted, which was to drive very fast. He got the truck started and he spun off, aiming for every mud hole that he could. He shot past a house with a washing machine on the front porch and two thin black men butchering a hog hanging from a tree. One of the men waved with a knife. Drinking, Neil drove through the mountains of trash at the dump and turned the truck in circles, kicking up muddy rooster tails. He swerved past a Negro church and the graveyard where a group of blacks huddled, 4 wobbling poles over an open grave, the wind tearing the preacher's hat out of his hands and a woman's umbrella reversing. When he tired of driving, he left the truck in their hiding place and, using the trees for balance, stumbled down the hill to their boat. He carried Kent's rifle, which he'd always admired, and he wore Kent's jacket. On the river, he fired up the outboard and accelerated, the boat prow lifting and leveling out, the buzz of the motor rising in the trees. The water was nearly orange from the mud, and the cypress knees nothing but knobs and tips because of the floods. A cottonmouth wound around most every one of them. Nearing the old train trestle, he cut the motor and coasted to a stop. He sat listening to the rain, to the distant barking of a dog a half a mile away, chasing something, maybe a deer. As the dog charged through the woods, Neil closed his eyes and imagined the terrain, marking where he thought the dog was now and where he thought it was now. Then the barking stopped suddenly as if the dog had run smack into a tree. Neil clicked on the trolling motor and moved the boat close to the edge of the river, the rifle across his knees. He scanned the banks, and when the rain started to fall harder, he accelerated toward the trestle. From beneath the cross ties, he smelled creosote and watched the rain as it stirred the river. He looked into the gray trees and thought he would drive into town later, see about getting Dan. Kent had never wanted to go to Grove Hill, and their father had warned them of the police and of jail. In town, your truck needed to have a tag and taillights that worked. Neil picked up one of the catfish from the night before. It was cold and stiff, as if carved out of wood. He stared at it, watching the green blowflies hover over his fist, and then threw it over into the weeds along the bank. The telephone rig was under the seat, and he lifted the chain quietly, considering what giant catfish might be passing beneath the boat this very second. A thing as large as a man's thigh, with eyes the shape of ripe plums and skin the color of mud. Catfish, their father had taught them, have long whiskers that make them the only fish that you can call. Kirksey had told Neil and his brothers that if the game warden caught you telephoning, all you needed to do was dump your box overboard. But Kirksey warned Frank David would handcuff you and jump overboard and swim around the bottom of the river until he found your rig. Neil spat a stream of tobacco juice into the water, and minnows appeared and began to investigate, nibbling at the dark yolk of spit as it elongated and dissolved. With the rifle's safety off, he lowered the chain into the water, then the wire, and a good distance apart. He checked the connections and then lifted the phone and began to crank. "Hello?" he whispered, the thing his father had always said, grinning in the dark. The wind picked up a bit and he heard a rattling in the trees, and he dialed faster. Had just seen the first silver body appear behind him when something landed with a clatter in the boat, and he glanced over. A bundle of dynamite, sparks hissing off the end, fuse already gone. He looked above him in the trestle, but nobody was there. He moved to grab the dynamite, but his cheeks ballooned with a hot red wind, and his hands caught fire. And when the smoke cleared and the water stopped boiling, silver bodies began to bob to the surface. Largemouth bass and brim and gar and suckers and white perch and pollywogs and catfish, some only stunned but others dead, and pieces of pink fruit-like things, the water blooming darkly with mud. Kirksey's telephone rang for the second time in one day, a rarity that proved that his wife had always said, "Bad news comes over the phone." The first call had been Esther telling him of Kent's death, Dan's arrest, and Neil's disappearance. This time Kirksey heard Goodlow's voice tell him that somebody, or maybe a couple of somebodies, had been blown up on the trestle. "Neil," Kirksey said, sitting. He arrived at the trestle and with his cane hobbled over the uneven tracks. Goodlow's deputies and 3 ambulance drivers in rubber gloves and waiters were scraping pieces off the cross ties with spoons and dropping the parts in Ziploc bags. The boat, 2 flattened shreds of aluminum, lay on the bank. In the water, minnows darted about, nibbling. "Christ," Kirksey said. He brought a handkerchief to his lips. Then he went to where Goodlow stood on the bank, writing in his notebook. "What do you aim to do about this?" Kirksey demanded. "We'll try to figure out who it was first." "You know goddamn well who it was." "Well, I expect, judging from that boat over yonder, it's either Neil or Kent Gates." "It's Neil," Kirksey said. Well, how do you know that? Kirksey told him that Kent was dead. Goodloe studied the storekeeper. I ain't seen the body, have you? Kirksey's blood pressure was going up. Fuck, sugar baby, are you one bit aware of what's going on here? Well, it's a fishing accident, Goodloe said. His bait exploded. From the bank, a deputy called that he'd found most of a boot. Foot's still in it, he said, holding it up by the lace. The deputy behind him gagged and turned away. Tag it, Goodloe said, writing something down. And keep looking. Puke on your own time. Kirksey poked Goodloe in the shoulder with his cane. You really think Neil would blow himself up? Goodloe looked at his shoulder, the muddy cane print, and then at the storekeeper. Not on purpose, I don't. And he paused. Of course, suicide does run in their family. You half-wit son of a bitch. What about Kent? Well, what about Kent? Christ, sugar baby. Goodloe held up his hand. Just show me, Kirksey. They left the ambulance drivers and the deputies and walked the other way without talking. And when they came to Goodloe's Blazer, they got in and drove without talking. Soon they stopped in front of the Gates cabin, and instantly hounds surrounded the truck, barking viciously and jumping with muddy paws against the glass. Goodloe blew the horn until the hounds slunk away, heads low and fangs bared. The sheriff opened his window and fired several times in the air, backing the dogs up. Before he and Kirksey got out, Goodloe reloaded. The hounds kept to the edge of the woods watching, while Kirksey led Goodloe behind the decrepit cabin. Rusty screens covered some windows and rags of drapes others. Beneath the house, the dogs paced them. Back here, Kirksey said, heading into the trees. Esther had said that they'd buried Kent, and this was the logical place. He went slowly, already out of breath, stopping to cough once, and sure enough, there lay the grave. You could see where the dogs had been scratching around it. Goodloe went over and towed the dirt. You know the cause of death? Yeah, dumbass, I know the cause of death. His name is Frank fucking David. I mean, how he was killed, said Goodloe. The boys said snake bite, 3 times in the neck, but I'd do an autopsy. Oh, you would, Goodloe exhaled. Okay, I'll send Roy and Avery over here to dig his ass up. Maybe shoot these damn dogs. I'll tell you what you better do first. You better keep Dan locked up safe. I can't hold him much longer, Goodloe said, unless he confesses. Kirksey swung at him with his cane and nearly lost his balance. At the edge of the woods, the dogs tensed, and Goodloe backed away, raising his pistol, the grave between them. Are you crazy, Kirksey? You been locked in that store too long? Goodloe, Kirksey gasped. The cotton in his left ear had come out, and the air was roaring through his head. Even you can't be this stupid. You let that boy out, and he's that cold-blooded fucker's next target. Target, Kirksey? Shit. Ain't nothing to prove anybody killed them damn boys. This one is snake bit, you said so yourself. That other one blowing himself up. Them darn Gateses had fished with dynamite their whole lives. You ought to know that. You the one gets it for 'em. He narrowed his eyes. You're about neck deep in this damn thing, you know that? And I don't mean just lying to protect them boys, neither. I mean selling explosives illegally to minors, Kirksey. I don't give a shit if I am, Kirksey yelled. 2 dead boys in 2 days and you're worried about dynamite? You ought to be out there looking for Frank David. You ain't supposed to be here for another week or 2, Goodloe said. Paperwork. He fired his pistol. Kirksey jumped and looked down at his chest to see the blood, but the sheriff was aiming past him, and when Kirksey followed his eyes, he saw the 3-legged dog that had been creeping in. It lay slumped in the mud, a hind leg kicking, and blood coloring the water around it. Goodloe backed up a step and smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. Around them, the other dogs circled, heads low, moving sideways, and the hair on their spines sticking up. Let's argue about this in the truck, Goodloe said. At the store, Kirksey put out the open sign. He sat in his chair with his coffee and a novel. He read the same page 3 times when it occurred to him to phone Montgomery and get Frank David's office on the line. It took a few calls, but he soon got the number and dialed it. The snippy young woman who answered told Kirksey that yes, Mr. David was supposed to take over the lower Peachtree district, but that he wasn't starting until next week, she thought. Well, where is he now? Kirksey wanted to know. Florida, she said. No. Louisiana, he's fishing. No, sir, he couldn't be reached. He preferred his vacations private. Kirksey slammed down the phone. He lit a cigarette and tried to think. It was just a matter, he decided, of keeping Dan alive until Frank David officially took over the district. There were probably other game wardens who'd testify that Frank David was indeed over in Louisiana fishing right now, but once the son of a bitch officially moved here, he'd have a motive because he'd known the dead game warden, and his alibi wouldn't be as strong. If Dan turned up dead, Frank David would be the chief suspect. Even Goodloe would be able to see that. Kirksey inhaled smoke deeply and tried to imagine how Frank David would think, how he would act, the noise he would make or not make as he went through the woods, what he would say if you happened upon him, or he upon you, what he would do if he came into the store. Certainly he wasn't a creature that Kirksey had created to scare the boys, not some wild ghostly thing. He was just a man who had had a hard life and who'd grown bitter and angry, a man who chose to uphold the law because breaking it was no challenge, a man with no obligation to any other men or a family, just to himself and his job, to some damn unwritten game warden code. His job was to protect the wild things the law had deemed worthy, deer and turkeys, alligators, but how did the Gates boys fall into the category of trash animal? Wildcats or possums or armadillos, snapping turtles, snakes, things you could kill any time, run over in your truck and not even look in your mirror to see it dying behind you. Why couldn't Frank David see that he, more than a match for the boys, was exactly the same as them? Kirksey drove to the highway. The big 30-06 he hadn't touched in years was on the seat next to him, and as he steered, he pushed the cartridges into the clip and then shoved the clip into the gun's underbelly. He pulled the lever that injected a cartridge into the chamber and took a long drink of whiskey to watch down the 3 pills that helped dull the ache in his knees and the one in his gut. It was almost dark when he arrived at the edge of the large field, and he parked facing the grass. This was a place a few hundred yards from a fairly well-traveled blacktop, a spot no sane poacher would dare use. There were already 2 or 3 deer creeping into the open from the woods across the field. They came to eat the tall grass, looking up only when a car passed, their ears swiveling, jaws frozen, and sprigs of grass twitching in their lips like the legs of an insect. Kirksey sat watching. He sipped his whiskey and lit a cigarette with a trembling hand. Both truck doors were locked, and he knew this was a very stupid thing that he was doing. Several times he told himself to just go home and let things unfold as they would. But then he saw the faces of the 2 dead boys and the face of the live one. When Boo had killed himself, the oldest 2 had barely been teenagers, but it was 12-year-old Dan who'd found him. That truck still had window glass then, and half the back window shield had been sprayed red with blood. Flies had gathered at the top of the truck around what Dan discovered to be a bullet hole, the pistol still clenched in his father's hand. The rim of Boo's hat still on his head, the top blown out, and Kirksey frowned thinking of it. The back of the truck was full of wood Boo'd been cutting, and the 3 boys had unloaded the wood and stacked it neatly beside the road. Kirksey shifted in his seat, imagining the boys pushing that truck for 2 miles over dirt roads, somehow finding the leverage or whatever, the goddamn strength to get it home, to pull their father from inside and bury him, to clean out the truck. Kirksey shuddered and thought of Frank David, and then made himself think of his wife instead. He rubbed his biceps and watched the shadows creep across the field, the tree line dimming, beginning to disappear. Soon it was full dark. He unscrewed the interior light bulb from the ceiling and rolled down the window and pulled the door lock up quietly. Holding his breath, he opened the door. Outside, he propped the rifle on the side mirror, flicked the safety off, and he reached through the window and felt alongside the dash for the headlight switch and pulled it. The field blazed with the eyes of deer, red hovering dots staring back at him. Kirksey aimed and squeezed the trigger at the first pair of eyes. Not wanting to see if he'd hit the deer, he moved the gun to another pair. He'd gotten off 7 shots before the eyes began to vanish. When the last echo from the gun faded, at least 3 deer lay dead or wounded in the glow of the headlights. One doe bleated weakly and bleated again. Kirksey coughed and took the gun back into the truck and closed the door and reloaded in the dark. Then he waited. The doe kept bleating, and things in the woods took shape, detached and whisked toward Kirksey over the grass like spooks. And the little noises, things like footsteps and the stories, Frank David appearing in the bed of someone's moving truck and punching through the back glass, grabbing and breaking the driver's arm, leaping from the truck and watching while it wrecked. "Quit it," Kirksey croaked, "you damn schoolgirl." Several more times that night he summoned his nerve and flicked on the headlights, firing at any eyes he saw or thought he saw, or firing at nothing. And when he finally fell asleep at 2 a.m., his body numb with painkillers and whiskey, he dreamed of his wife on the day of her first miscarriage. The way the nurses couldn't find the vein in her arm and how they'd kept trying with the needle, and the way she'd cried and held his fingers tightly like a woman giving birth. He started awake, terrified, as if he'd fallen asleep driving. Caring less for silence, he stumbled from the truck and flicked on the lights and fired, though now there were no eyes. He lowered the gun and for no reason found himself thinking of a time when he'd tried fly fishing, standing in his yard with his wife watching from the porch, Tarzan of the Apes in her lap, and him whipping the line in the air, showing off, and then the strange pulling you get when you catch a fish, and Betty jumping to her feet, the book falling, and her yelling that he'd caught a bat. For heaven's sakes, a bat! He climbed back into the truck. His hands shook so hard that he had trouble getting the door locked. He bowed his head, missing her so much that he cried, softly, for a long time. Dawn found him staring at a field littered with dead does and yearlings and fawns, and one of the deer, only wounded, was trying to crawl toward the safety of the trees. Kirksey got out of the truck and vomited colorless water, and then stood looking around the foggy morning. He lifted his rifle and limped into the grass in the drizzle, and a quick hip shot put the live deer out of its misery. He was sitting on the open tailgate trying to light a cigarette when Goodloe and a deputy passed in their blazer and stopped. The sheriff stepped out, signaling for the deputy to stay put. He sat beside Kirksey on the tailgate, the truck dipping with his weight. His stomach was growling. "You old fool," Goodloe said, staring at Kirksey and then behind them at the field. "You figured to make Frank David show himself." He shook his head. "Good Lord Almighty, Kirksey, what'll it take to prove to you that there ain't no darn vigilante game warden out there?" Kirksey didn't answer. Goodloe went to the blazer and told the deputy to pick him up at the old man's store. "Get Dave over here to load up them deer, quick," he said. "Tell him to gut 'em and drop 'em off at my place in the barn." The deputy put the blazer into gear. "Could I have some of the tenderloins, boss?" Goodloe slammed the door. At Kirksey's truck, he helped the old man into the passenger seat and went around and got in the driver's seat. He took the rifle and unloaded it and put its clip in his pocket. "We'll talk about them deer later," he said. "Now I better get you back." They'd gone a silent mile when Kirksey said, "Would you mind running me by Esther's?" Goodloe shrugged and turned that way. His stomach made a strangling noise, and he patted it absently. The rain and the wind were picking up, rocking the truck. The sheriff took a bottle of bourbon from his pocket. "It's medicinal," he said, handing it to Kirksey. "It's just been 2 freak accidents, that's all, Kirksey. I seen some strange shit in my life, a lot stranger than this. I seen a nigger had rabies one time, all foaming at the mouth, bit his darn wife on her titty before she shot him. It's a hell of a thing, buddy boy." And he took the bottle back. "Them Gateses is just an unlucky bunch, period. I ain't one to go believing in curses, Kirksey, but I swear to God if they ain't just downright snake bit." Soon, Goodloe parked in front of Esther's, and they sat waiting for the rain to slack. And Kirksey rubbed his knees and looked out the windows where the bottoms of the trees were submerged in the rising floodwaters. "They say old Esther has a root cellar," Goodloe said, taking a sip. "Shit, I expect it's full of water this time of year, ain't it? She's probably got cottonmouths wrapped around her plumbing." He shuddered and offered the bottle, and Kirksey took it and sipped. He gave it back, and then Goodloe drank and drank again. Lord, if that don't hit the spot. "When I was in the service," Goodloe went on, "over in Thailand, they had them little bitty snakes, them banded crates, they call 'em. Poisonous cobras, what they told us. Used to hide up under the commode lid. Every time you took a shit, you'd have to lift the lid up, see was one there." He drank. "Yep, it was many a time I kicked one off in the water, flushed it down the commode." "Wait here," Kirksey said. And he opened the door, and his pants leg darkened as the rain poured in, cold as needles. He set his knee out deliberately and planted his cane in the mud and pulled himself up and stood in the water to his ankles. He limped across the yard with his hand before his face, blocking the rain. There were 2 chickens on the front porch, their feathers fluffed out so that they looked strange and menacing. Kirksey climbed the porch steps with the pain so strong in his knees that stars were popping near his face by the time he reached the top. He leaned against the house, breathing hard, touching himself at the throat where a tie might have gone. And then he rapped gently on the hook of the cane, and the door opened immediately. It was dark inside, and she stood there looking at him. "How come you don't ever stop by the store anymore?" Well, she folded her arms. "Neil's dead," he said. "I heard," Esther said, "and I'm leaving. Fuck this place and every one of y'all." She closed the door, and Kirksey would never see her again. At the store, Goodloe nodded for the deputy to stay in the Blazer, and then he took Kirksey by the elbow and helped him up the steps. He unlocked the door for the old man and held his icy hand as he sank in his chair. "You want those boots off?" Goodloe asked, spreading a blanket over Kirksey's lap. He bent and unlaced the left and then the right. "Pick up your foot. Now the other one." He set the wet boots by the stove. "It's a little damp in here. I like this thing." He found a box of kitchen matches on the shelf under the counter among the glass figurines Kirksey's wife had collected. The little deer, the figure skater, the unicorn. Goodloe got a fire going in the stove and stood warming the backs of his legs. "I'll bring Dan by a little later," he said, but Kirksey didn't seem to hear. Goodloe sat in his office with his feet on his desk, rolling a cartridge between his fingers. A plate of ribs sat untouched before him. Despite himself, he was beginning to wonder if Kirksey might be right. Maybe Frank David was out there on the prowl. Good lawmen would at least consider the possibility. He stood and took off his pistol belt and walked to the back and pushed open the swinging door and had Roy buzz him through. So far, he'd had zero luck getting anything out of Dan. The boy just sat in a cell wrapped in a blanket, his head shaved for lice, not talking to anybody and not eating. Goodloe had told him about his brother's death, and he'd seen no emotion cross the boy's face. Goodloe figured that it wasn't this youngest one who'd killed that game warden. It'd probably been the other 2. He knew that this boy wasn't carrying a full cylinder by the way he never talked, but most likely he had been a witness. Goodloe had even considered calling a psychologist from the Searcy Mental Hospital to give the boy an evaluation. "Come on," said Goodloe, stopping by Dan's cell and jingling the keys. "I'm fixing to put your talent to some good use." He kept the boy cuffed as the deputy drove them toward the trestle. "Turn your head, Dave," Goodloe said, handing Dan a pint of Old Crow. The boy took it in both hands and unscrewed the lid and began to drink too fast. "Slow down there, partner," Goodloe said, taking back the bottle. "You need to be a bit alert." Soon they stood near the trestle, gazing at the flat shape of the boat on the bank. Dan knelt and examined the ground. The deputy came up and started to say something, but Goodloe motioned for quiet. "Just like a bloodhound," he whispered. "Maybe I ought to give him your job." "Reckon what he's after?" the deputy asked. Dan scrabbled up the trestle and the two men followed. The boy walked slowly over the rails, first staring into the trees and then examining the spaces between the cross ties. He stopped and bent down and peered at something, and he picked it up. "What you got there, boy?" Goodloe called, going and squatting beside him. He took a sip of Old Crow. When Dan hit him, two-handed, the bottle flew one way and Goodloe flew the other. Both landed in the river, and Goodloe with his hand clapped to his head to keep his hat on. He came up immediately, bobbing and sputtering, and on the trestle the deputy tackled Dan when they went down fighting on the cross ties. Below, Goodloe dredged himself out of the water, and he came ashore dripping and tugged his pistol from its holster. He held it up so that a trickle of orange water fell, and he took off his hat and looked up to see the deputy disappear belly first into the face of the river. Dan sprinted back down the track toward the swamp. The deputy came boiling ashore. He had his own pistol drawn and was looking around vengefully. Goodloe climbed the trestle in time to see Dan disappear in the woods. The sheriff chased him for a while, ducking limbs and vines, but stopped and breathing hard, his hands on his side and his cheeks red. Dan circled back through the woods and went quickly over to the soft ground, scrambling up the sides of hills and sliding down the other sides. 2 hollers over, he heard the deputy heading in the wrong direction. Dan slowed a little and trotted for a long time in the rain, the cuffs rubbing his wrists raw. He stopped and looked at what he'd been carrying in one hand, a match, limp and black, now with water nearly dissolved. And he stood looking at the trees around him, the hanging Spanish moss and the cypress knees rising from the stagnant creek to his left. The hair on the back of his neck rose, and he knelt tilting his head and closing his eyes, and he listened. He heard the rain, heard it hit the leaves and wood, and heard the puddles lapping at their tiny banks, but beyond those sounds there were other sounds. A mockingbird mocking a blue jay, a squirrel barking, another answering, and the deputy falling a quarter-mile away. Then another sound, this one close, a match striking. Dan began to run before opening his eyes and crashed into a tree. He rolled to his feet, ran again, tearing through limbs and briars and spider webs. He leapt small creeks and slipped and got up, and he kept running, and at every turn he expected Frank David, and he was near tears when he finally stumbled into his family's graveyard. The first thing he saw was that Kent had been dug up. Wooden stakes surrounded the hole and fenced it with yellow tape that had words on it. Dan approached slowly, his fists under his chin. Something floated in the grave. With his heart pounding, he peered inside. It was the big 3-legged hound. Wary of the trees behind him, he crept toward their backyard, stopping at the edge, and he crouched and blew into his hands to warm his cheeks, and gazed at the dark windows of their cabin, and then circled the house, keeping to the woods. He saw the pine tree with the low limb they used for stringing up larger animals to clean, and the rusty chain hanging, and the iron pipe they struck through the back legs of a deer or the rare wild pig. Kent and Neil had usually done the cleaning while Dan fed the guts to their dogs and tried to keep them from fighting. And there, past the tree, scattered, lay the rest of the dogs, all shot dead and partially eaten. Buzzards standing in the mud staring boldly at him with their heads bloody and their beaks open. It was dark when Kirksey woke in his chair. He had heard the door creak. Someone stood there, and the storekeeper was afraid until he smelled the river. "Hey, boy," he said. Dan ate 2 cans of potted meat with his fingers and a candy bar and a box of saltines. Kirksey gave him a Coke from the red cooler, and he drank it, took another one while Kirksey got a hacksaw from the rack of tools behind the counter. He slipped the cardboard wrapping off and nodded for Dan to sit. The storekeeper pulled up another chair and faced the boy and began sawing the handcuff chain. The match dropped out of Dan's hand, but neither saw it. Dan sat with his head down and his palms up and his wrists on his knees, breathing heavily, while Kirksey worked and silver shavings had accumulated in a pile between their boots. The boy didn't lift his head the entire time, and he'd been asleep for quite a while when Kirksey finally saw it through. The old man rose, flexing his sore hands, and he got a blanket from a shelf, and he unfolded it, shook out the dust, and spread it over Dan. He went to the door and turned the deadbolt. The phone rang later. It was Goodloe asking about the boy and telling what had happened. Kirksey nearly smiled. "You been lost all this time, sugar baby?" "Reckon I have," Goodloe admitted, "and we still ain't found Deputy Dave yet." For a week they stayed in the store together. At times Kirksey could barely walk, and other times the pain in his side was worse than ever. He gave the boy a stocking cap to cover his skinned head and put him to work sweeping and dusting and scrubbing the shelves. He had Dan pull a table next to his chair, and Kirksey did something he hadn't done in years. He took inventory. With the boy's help, he counted and ledgered each item, marking it in his long green book. The back shelf contained canned soups, vegetables, sardines, and tins of meat. Many of the cans were so old that the labels flaked off in Kirksey's hand, and so they were unmarked when Dan replaced them in the rings they'd made, not only in the dust, but on the wood itself. In the back of that last shelf, Dan discovered 4 tins of Underwood deviled ham, and as their labels fell away at Kirksey's touch, he remembered a time when he'd purposely unwrapped the paper from these cans because each label showed several red dancing devils, and some of his colored customers had refused to buy them. Kirksey now understood that his store was dead, that it no longer provided a service. His colored customers had stopped coming for years. The same with Esther, and for the past few years, except for an occasional hunter or logger, he'd been in business for the Gates boys alone. He looked across the room at Dan, spraying a window with Windex and wiping it absently, gazing outside. The boy wore the last of the new denim overalls Kirksey had in stock, and they were too short by an inch or two. Once when the store had thrived, he'd had many sizes, but for the longest time now, the only ones he'd stocked were the boy sizes. That night, beneath his standing lamp, Kirksey began again to read his wife's copy of Tarzan of the Apes to Dan. He sipped his whiskey and spoke clearly to be heard over the rain. And when he paused to turn a page, he saw that the boy lay asleep across the row of chairs they'd arranged in the shape of a bed. Looking down through his bifocals, Kirksey flipped to the front of the book and saw his wife's name written in her neat script. He moved his thumb over to it and he read it to himself, and then he turned to the back of the book to the list of other Tarzan novels, 24 in all, and he decided to order them through the mail so that he and Dan would know the complete adventures of Tarzan of the Apes. In the morning, Goodloe called and said that Frank David had officially arrived. The sheriff himself had witnessed the swearing in, and he was now this district's new game warden. "Pretty nice fella," Goodloe said, "kind of quiet and polite, asked me how the fishing was." Then it's over, Kirksey thought. A week later, Kirksey told Dan that he had business in Grove Hill. He'd spent the night before trying to decide whether to take the boy with him, but had decided not to, that he couldn't watch him forever. Besides, town wasn't the best place for a Gates. Before he left, he gave Dan his 30-06 and told him to stay put, not to leave for anything. And for himself, Kirksey took an old .22 bolt action and placed it in the back window rack of his truck, and he waved to Dan and he drove off. He thought that if the boy wanted to run away, it was his own choice. Kirksey owed him the chance, at least. At the doctor's office, the tired-looking young surgeon frowned and removed his glasses when he told Kirksey that the cancer was advancing, that he'd need to check into the hospital in Mobile immediately. It was way past time. "Just look at your color," the surgeon said. And Kirksey stood and thanked the man, and put on his hat, and he limped outside. He went by the post office and placed his order for the Tarzan books, and he shot for the supplies in the dollar store using the buggy for support, and then the Piggly Wiggly, and had the checkout boys put the boxes in the front seat beside him. Coming out of the drugstore, he remembered that it was Saturday, that there'd be chicken fights today, and possible news about Frank David. At Heflin's, Kirksey paid his $5 admission and let Heflin help him to a seat in the bottom of the stands. He poured some whiskey into his coffee and sat studying the crowd. Nobody had mentioned Frank David, but a few old-timers had offered their sympathies for the deaths of Kent and Neil. Down in the pit, the Cajuns were back, and during the 8th match, one of the Cajun Whites versus a local Red, the tall ball Cajun stooping and circling the tangled birds and licking his lips as his rooster swarmed the other and hooked it, the barn smoky and dark, and rain splattering on the tin roof, and the door swung open. Instantly, the crowd was hushed. Feathers settled to the ground. Even the Cajuns knew who he was. He stood at the door, unarmed, his hands on his hips. He was a wiry man. He lifted his chin and people tried to hide their drinks. His giant ears, that hooked nose, the eyes. The bird handlers reached over their shoulders, clawing at the numbered pieces of masking tape on their backs. The two handlers and the referee in the ring sidled out, leaving the roosters. For a full minute, Frank David stood staring, and people stepped out the back door and climbed out the windows. Half-naked boys in the rafters were frozen like monkeys and hypnotized by a snake. Frank David's gaze did not stop on Kirksey, but settled instead on the roosters, the white one pecking at the red's eyes. Outside, trucks roared to life, backfiring like gunshots. Kirksey placed his hands on his knees, and he rose and turned up his coat collar and flung his coffee out. And Frank David still hadn't looked at him. Kirksey planted his cane and made his way painfully out the back door and through the mud. Not a person in sight, just clattering tailgates vanishing into the woods. From inside his truck, Kirksey watched Frank David walk away from the barn and head toward the trees. He watched him step around a mud puddle. Now he was just a burly, bow-legged man with white hair. And Kirksey felt behind him for the .22 rifle with one hand while rolling down the window with the other. He had a little trouble aiming the gun with his shaky arms. He pulled back the bolt. He flicked the safety off. The sight of the rifle wavered between Frank David's shoulders as the game warden walked, as if an old storekeeper were nothing to fear. Closing one eye, Kirksey pulled the trigger. He didn't hear the shot, though later he would notice his ears ringing. Frank David's coat bloomed out to the side, and he missed a step, and he stopped and put his hand to his lower right side and looked over his shoulder at Kirksey, who was fumbling with the rifle's bolt action. And then Frank David was gone, just wasn't there. There were only the trees, bent in the rain and shreds of fog in the air. And for a moment, Kirksey wondered if he'd seen a man at all, or if he'd shot at something out of his own imagination. If the cancer that had started in his pancreas had spread up along his spine and into his brain and was deceiving him, forming men out of air and walking them across fields, giving them hands and eyes and the power to disappear. From inside the barn, a rooster crowed. Kirksey remembered Dan. He hung the rifle in the rack and started his truck and gunned the engine. He banged over the field and flattened saplings and a fence, and though he couldn't feel his feet, he drove very fast. Not until 2 days later, in the VA hospital in Mobile, would Kirksey finally begin to piece it all together. Parts of that afternoon were patchy and hard to remember. Shooting at Frank David, going to the store and finding it empty, no sign of a struggle, the .30-06 gone, as if Dan had walked out on his own and taken the gun. Kirksey could remember getting back into his truck. He'd planned to drive to Grove Hill and the courthouse, the game warden's office, and find Frank David and finish the job. But somewhere along the way, he blacked out behind the wheel and veered off the road into a ditch. He barely remembered the rescue workers and the lights and the sirens, Goodloe himself pulling Kirksey out. Later that night, 2 coon hunters had stumbled across Dan, wandering along the riverbank, his face and shirt covered in blood, the .30-06 nowhere to be found. When Goodloe told the semi-conscious Kirksey what happened, the storekeeper turned silently to the window where he saw only the reflected face of an old, dying, failed man. And later still, in the warm haze of morphine, Kirksey lowered his eyelids and let his imagination unravel and retwine the mystery of Frank David. It was as if Frank David himself appeared in the chair where Goodloe had sat, as if the game warden broke the seal on a bottle of Jim Beam and leaned forward on his elbows and touched the bottle to Kirksey's cracked lips and whispered to him a story about boots going overland and then gunshot and rain washing the blood trail away even as the boots passed. About a tired old game warden taking his hand out of his coat and seeing the blood there and feeling it trickle along his side and down the back of his leg. And about the boy in the game warden's truck, handcuffed and gagged and blindfolded, about driving carefully through the deep ruts in the road, stopping behind Esther's empty house and carrying the kicking wet boy inside on his shoulder. When the blindfold is removed, Dan has trouble focusing but knows where he is because of her smell. Bacon and soap, and cigarettes and dust, and Frank David holds what looks like a pillowcase. He comes across the room and puts the pillowcase down. He rubs his eyes and sits on the bed beside Dan. He puts on a pair of reading glasses and opens a book of matches and lights a cigarette. Holds the filtered end to Dan's lips, but the boy doesn't inhale. And Frank David puts the cigarette in his own lips and the embers glow. Then he drops it on the floor and crushes it out with his boot and picks up the butt and slips it into his shirt pocket. He puts his hand over the boy's watery eyes, the skin of his palm dry and hard, cool, and the faint smell of blood, and he moves his fingers over Dan's nose and lips and chin. And he stops at his throat and holds the boy tightly, but not painfully. In a strange way, Dan can't understand, and he finds it reassuring. His thudding heart slows. Something is struggling beside his shoulder. Frank David takes the thing from the bag. Now the smell of the room changes, and Dan begins to thrash and whip his head from side to side. "Goddamn, son," Frank David whispers. "I hate to civilize you." Goodloe began going to the Veterans Hospital in Mobile once a week. He brought Kirksey cigarettes from his store. There weren't any private rooms available in the hospital, and the beds around the storekeeper were filled with dying ex-soldiers who never talked. But Kirksey was beside a window, and Goodloe would raise the glass and prop it open with a novel. They smoked together and drank whiskey from paper cups, listening for nurses. It was the tall, mean one. One more time, goddammit, she said, coming out of nowhere and plucking the cigarettes from their lips so quickly that they were still puckered. Sometimes Goodloe would push Kirksey down the hall when they would get a good wheelchair, the IV rack attached by a stainless steel contraption with a black handle the shape of a flower. And they would go to the elevator and ride down 3 floors to the covered area where people smoked and talked about the weather. There were nurses and black cafeteria workers in white uniforms and hairnets and people visiting other people and a few patients. Occasionally, in the halls, they'd see some mean old fart Kirksey knew, and they'd talk about hospital food or chicken fighting, or the fact that Frank David had surprised everyone by deciding to retire after only a month of quiet duty, that the new game warden was from Texas, and a nigger to boot. Then Goodloe would wheel Kirksey back along the long window, out of which they could see the tops of oak trees. On one visit, Goodloe told Kirksey they'd taken Dan out of intensive care. 3 weeks later, he said the boy had been discharged. "I give him a ride to the store," Goodloe said. This was in late May, and Kirksey was a yellow skeleton with hands that shook. "I'll stop by and check on him every evening," Goodloe went on. "He'll be okay. The doctor says he just needs to keep them bandages changed. I can do that, I reckon." They were quiet then for a time, just the coughs of the dying men and the soft swishing of nurses' thighs and the hum of IV machines. "Goodloe," Kirksey whispered, "I'd like you to help me with something." The sheriff leaned in to hear, an unlit cigarette behind his ear like a pencil. Kirksey's tongue was white and cracked, and his breath was awful. "I'd like to change my will," he said. "Make the boy the beneficiary." "All right," said Goodloe. "I'm obliged," whispered Kirksey, and he closed his eyes. Near the end, he was delirious. He said he saw a tiny black creature at the foot of his bed. Said it had him by the toe. In surprising fits of strength, he would throw his water pitcher at it, or his box of tissues, or the Reader's Digest. Restraints were called for, and his coma was a relief to everyone, and he died quietly in the night. In Kirksey's chair in the store, Dan hadn't seemed to hear Goodloe's questions. The sheriff had done some looking into the Grove Hill Public Library, research was the modern word, and discovered that one species of cobra spat venom at its victim's eyes, but there weren't such snakes in southern Alabama. Anyway, the hospital lab had confirmed that it was the poison of a cottonmouth that had blinded Dan. The question, of course, was who had put the venom in his eyes. Goodloe shuddered to think of it, how they'd found Dan staggering about, howling in pain and bleeding from his tear ducts, the skin around his eye sockets dissolving, exposing the white ridges of his skull. In the investigation, several local blacks, including Euphrates Morissette, stated to Goodloe that the youngest Gates boy and his 2 dead brothers had molested Euphrates' stepdaughter in their own home. There was a rumor that several black men dressed in white sheets with pillowcases for hoods had caught and punished Dan as he lurked along the river, peeping in folks' windows and doing unwholesome things to himself. Others suggested that the conjure woman had cast a spell on the Gateses, that she'd summoned a swamp demon to chase them to hell, and still others attributed the happenings to Frank David. There were a few occurrences of violence between the local whites and the blacks, and some fires and a broken jaw, but soon it died down and Goodloe filed the deaths of Kent and Neil Gates as accidental. But he listed Dan's blinding as unsolved. The snake venom had bleached the boy's pupils white, and the skin around the eye socket had required grafts. The surgeons had had to use skin from his buttocks, and because his buttocks were hairy, the skin around his eyes began to grow hair too. In the years to come, the loggers who clear-cut the land along the river would occasionally stop in the store, less from a need to buy something, and more from a curiosity to see the hermit with the milky, hairy eyes. The store smelled horrible, like the inside of a bear's mouth, and dust lay thick and soft on the shelves. Because they had come in, the loggers felt obligated to buy something, but every item was moldy or stale beyond belief, except for the things in the cans, which were unlabeled so they never knew what they'd get. Nothing was marked as to price either, and the blind man wouldn't talk. He just sat by the stove, so the loggers paid more, and some less, than what they thought a can was worth, leaving the money on the counter by the telephone, which hadn't been connected in years. When plumper, grayer Goodloe came by on the occasional evening smelling of booze, he'd take the bills and coins and put some in Kirksey's cash drawer and the rest in his pocket. He was no longer sheriff, having lost several elections back to one of his deputies, Roy or Dave. He still wore the same khaki uniform, but now he drove a Lance truck, and his route included the hospitals and the county, and every other month, the prison. "Damn, boy," he once cracked to Dan, "this store's doing better business now than it ever has. You sure you don't want a cookie rack?" When Goodloe left, Dan listened to the rattle of the truck as it faded. "Sugar baby," he whispered. And many a night for years after, until his own death in his sleep, Dan would rise from the chair and move across the floor, taking Kirksey's cane from where it stood by the coat rack. And he would go outside and down the stairs like a man who could see, and his beard nearly to his belly, and he would walk soundlessly the length of the building, knowing the woods even better now as he crept down the rain-rutted gully toward the river whose smell never left the caves of his nostrils and the roof of his mouth. At the riverbank he would stop and sit with his back against a small pine, and lifting his white eyes to the sky, he would listen to the clicks and hum and throttle of the woods, seeking out each noise at its source and imagining it, an acorn nodding and detaching its thin ricochet, and the way it settled into the leaves, a bullfrog's bubbling throat and the things it said, and the trickle of the river over rocks around the bases of cattails and cypress knees and through the wet hanging roots of trees. And then another sound, familiar, the soft, precise footsteps of Frank David, downwind, not coming closer, not going away, circling, the striking of a match and the sizzle of ember and fall of ash, the ascent of smoke, a strange and terrifying comfort for the rest of Dan Gates' life. Hope you all enjoyed that story. Poachers is a short story by Tom Franklin. It is a story from a collection of short stories by the same name, Poachers. I think the book won an award. I think it's the Edgar Award. I'm not sure. I saw an interview with Tom Franklin, and he said it won an award, and he didn't even know what the award was. He had to ask his agent. He goes, what award is this? I'm sure he knows now. Anyway, I sent an email to Tom about a month ago, and I asked him if I could read a story or two from this book, and his answer back to me was hell yes. That's all he sent back. And so he's probably a pretty good guy. If he hears this, I certainly do appreciate him giving me permission to read this great story. I love this style of writing. It's so easy for me to follow, especially when it's set in a region where I'm familiar with and I can relate to the characters. And so I love this story. Tom has several novels available, plus this book of short stories. I'll put his author page linked in Amazon in the description, and you guys can look him up and buy his books, and you will not be disappointed. If you like good literature, good modern literature, you'll enjoy this stuff. So thank you all for listening, and we will see you on the next podcast. Thanks.